0.0% of women in engineering and computer science fields. And then you do see a gradual trend upward. So you're seeing that the dip that we were talking about, but it's still a gradual trend upward. And this is precisely the sort of pattern you would expect to see if the issues around women participating in technology were social issues. Women obviously have not grown new brains over the past few decades. I mean, that would be awesome if we were, because I'd love to have a bigger brain. But actually what we're seeing is specifically a social trend. Women are increasing their visibility in many, many areas, including in science and engineering. And so we're still seeing this general upward trend as a result of social transformations, not like nanotechnology getting into our brains and making us like cyber women or whatever. If any of you actually saw the Doctor Who episode with the cyber women, you know how terrible that would be. Actually, sorry, that wasn't Doctor Who, that was Torchwood. Okay, there's a Billie Piper supporter in the audience. Can you get him out of here? No, we're not going to tolerate any Billie Piper in here. Okay, so what else did I want to mention about that? That's what I wanted to mention about that. So basically the question is, now we get to the meaty part. Now we kind of move beyond statistics and into a realm that pretty much only sort of humanities types have gone into before, which is how do we make sure that that trend we were looking at continues to go upward? How do we make sure that more and more women are entering the fields of computer science and engineering and other sciences? In other words, how do we make the future safe for female geeks? How do we have more Grace Hoppers with those awesome glasses that she's got on there? And so basically, in order to talk about that, what I'm going to do is take us into a detour into the realm of mythology and fantasy. Because it's my contention that one of the main things that's holding women back in these areas is myths about what women are capable of. And these are myths that women have internalized, they're myths that men have internalized, they're myths about how the sexes interact with each other. No one is really to blame. This is not about like men have imposed X and Y on us and women have done blah, blah, blah as a result. This is really about social myths that we all buy into and that we all need to stop buying into if we want to change the gender ratio. So myth number one, I bet you've all heard this myth about 1 million frickin' times. Women aren't interested in technology. It's always the thing where you'll hear the boys saying, oh, well, I like hacking, but my girlfriend doesn't like it, and that's just because women don't like tech. Or women will say, oh, I'm just a girl, so I'm not interested in tech. Obviously, that's crap. We know that that's not true. Here's just a few lovely examples of women in history who've been interested in computers, whose images I've appropriated from the internet, except for the image of the women from Survival Research Laboratories who gave me permission to use it. At any rate, Ada Lovelace, obviously, many have credited with inventing the first computer language. Women were heavily involved in doing programming on early computers in the 1940s. Women continue to be interested in programming computers. I don't need to prove this to you, but the pictures are there. One of the things I wanted to say about that is that this whole idea that women aren't interested in technology is what leads directly to kind of clueless statements such as, there are no women hackers. That leads to somebody literally standing where I'm standing right here, where I can see a shitload of women in this room, and lead someone to be in this exact position and say, there aren't any women here, because people are so under the spell of this myth that women just don't like technology. How do we combat this myth? Well, it's very easy. I mean, basically, it's all about visibility. It's about paying attention to these kinds of images, paying attention to these kinds of examples, and also paying attention to the women around us and saying, oh, yeah, that woman is interested in technology. Duh, why didn't I think of that before? Please don't quote me on the duh thing, although I guess this is being recorded. But anyway, so that's a pretty simple myth. The next myth is a little bit more complex and has a lot of layers that I want to get into. There's this myth that, first of all, one of the assumptions in this myth is that people who do technology are smart. So we're not going to interrogate that myth. We'll just assume that people who do technology are smart. But then there's this myth that smart women aren't attractive. In other words, women who do technology are not attractive. And the double whammy is women should be attractive, right? So the problem is that if a woman wants to be attractive or somehow values being attractive because she wants to get laid just like all of us do, that she shouldn't be playing with computers because that will make her not attractive. And I have these images up here. They're images from Ice Princess, a really amazing American film, as well as another American film called She's All That. These are both, She's All That is from the late 90s and Ice Princess is from the noughties. These are both narratives, and particularly She's All That was a very popular film in the United States. I don't know if it made it over to Europe or not, but it was basically about a girl who's a geek. She's a high school nerd. She likes to make art out of circuit boards, and she's really weird and wears glasses. That's a picture of her up at the top in her nerd outfit, in which the film is trying to tell us she's not attractive. She meets a nice boy, and through her sexual involvement and heterosexual yayness or whatever, she learns that what's really important is being pretty. And so she becomes prettier at the end. The guy who's gotten involved with her, you know, it's one of those farces where he did it on a dare, but then he really falls in love with her, blah, blah, blah. They go to the prom together, and she's completely basically given up on her geekiness and her art by the end of the film. She's been redeemed by the love of a good man and discovering that she's actually pretty. Now, the way that this fits into, and Ice Princess has a similar premise where the young woman is a physics genius, and she decides she wants to become a pretty ice skater instead of going to Harvard. And yeah. She gets to wear really cute outfits. And those of you who watched the last few seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer will recognize that is Dawn, Buffy's annoying younger sister, who got to play the Ice Princess. So now this is I sort of make jokes about this because it's easy to joke about, but one of the ways that this myth is particularly poisonous for women who are working in the fields of technology is that it sets up a dichotomy between being sexually appealing in any way and working with men in the workplace. And if you're going to be a woman in technology, you're going to have to work with men. It's very important that women get mentored by men just as much as they get mentored by women. Many of the people who mentored me were men. Many of the women who have achieved high levels within their fields in technology and science have been mentored by men. But because of this myth, there's a really strong push to keep men from mentoring women because there's this idea that women might at any moment become sexual. They might somehow, if they're being mentored by a man, other people might look at that relationship as being somehow potentially a sexual relationship. And so they might assume, well, because this woman is working with this male mentor, maybe it's just because she's secretly giving him blowjobs in his office. Or, it doesn't have to be that literal, right? It could be, it's just that he wants to have sex with her. So he's mentoring her not because she's genuinely bright, but because he has some kind of sexual interest in her, or vice versa. She has some sexual interest in him, and therefore the relationship is taken out of the realm of the professional, and it becomes not, say, an honor that this woman has worked with a prestigious man in her field, but something that's suspicious. And this is a myth that really poisons both women and men in the workplace and their ability to work together, because there's this idea that, as I said, at any minute a woman might become sexual and create some kind of problem, or undermine the work that's going on, or undermine her own credibility, or undermine the credibility of the men around her. And so busting this myth is more than just saying, let's not gossip about people's sex lives. It's about encouraging men and women to work together in mentoring relationships and workplace relationships without worrying that, it might become sexual, or without assuming that that means that the women around them have become desexualized. The fact is, when men and women work together, some people might have a little sex, just like when a bunch of men work together. Some of the men are going to have sex with each other. It happens. It's not a big deal. The fact is, most people aren't doing that. Most people who have workplace relationships and mentoring relationships are just doing it because they love the work and because they want to get guidance. So that's a really important myth that we need to be busting. And like I said, one of the ways to bust the myth is just encourage men to mentor women in the workplace and encourage those relationships to happen and not assume that they have some ulterior meaning. Here's my final myth that I want to talk about tonight, which is, again, an incredibly pervasive myth, very multi-layered. The myth is, quite simply, that women would rather have family and pay attention to babies than stay up all night coding in the lab or stay up all night doing whatever it is that they're doing in the lab with, if it's biotech or whatever. There's this notion that when men take jobs, that they will have a spouse who may take care of a baby, and that they won't be distracted by things like reproduction, but that women have some kind of either biological urge or social pressure to do that. The new study that's come out from the NAS, this is a little bit of stuff that I'll get to in a minute that's up on the slide right now. The new study from the NAS dealt with this myth a lot. One of the really depressing statistics from an earlier study showed that 35% of unemployed female scientists and engineers cite family responsibilities as the reason why they are not working in their chosen fields. So this isn't a small thing. One of the interesting things about the new National Academy of Sciences study that just came out a few months ago, by the way, is that they explored this a lot more, and one thing that they found was that when women get letters of recommendation from supervisors, their family lives are mentioned 6 times more often than men's family lives are mentioned. Now, there's nothing wrong with mentioning someone's family life, but when you see a pattern like that, what you're seeing is the building up of this myth, again, that women are associated with the family, and that being associated with the family means that they won't somehow be as competent as men are, or as focused as men are in the workplace. Now again, what's interesting, and the reason why I put up these 2 examples of propaganda here, one from the 1940s during World War II in the United States, and one from 2006 in the United States, is that we can clearly see a relationship between social propaganda and women's roles. This picture to your right, no, to your left, my right, is of Rosie the Riveter, who's an incredibly famous icon. And this was during a period of time when women were being encouraged to take science and engineering jobs because men were at war during World War II. And a lot of women did move into those jobs as a result of this kind of propaganda. And now, today, we're seeing something of the opposite propaganda at work, where you get, for example, I love this, it's so amazing. This article that appeared in Esquire quite recently has sort of broken the blogosphere in half. Everybody's been pissy about it. At any rate, there's this fantastic physicist named Naomi Halas who's done amazing work with nanoshells and is sort of revolutionizing the way we understand nanotech. And this profile of her in Esquire has this whole section where it talks about how she was married and how she didn't have kids and what that meant to her. And think about how silly that would sound if it was a guy. Can you imagine saying, you know, happily married for 20 years to a theoretical physicist he met at IBM, he was unable to have children. Maybe, he thinks, he was meant to do this instead. Again, there's nothing incredibly poisonous and horrible about this. It's not saying she's a bad physicist because she has breasts. And that's a picture of her, by the way, looking a lot like Rosie the Riveter, which I kind of like, Rosie the Riveter with a computer. But instead what it's suggesting is that women, again, are more associated with children and families than they are with professional work. And so this is just a pervasive myth that we see again and again and again, where women's competence and women's dedication is constantly undermined by this reference to the fact that they might reproduce or that they might not reproduce, and that somehow that would be relevant to their work lives, which it's not. And I think that this is partly a result of growing conservatism in the United States, that we're seeing a lot of this stuff. I don't know that there's an equivalent type of propaganda in Europe. But there is, I mean, the US is obviously going through a pretty wacky time politically, shall we say. So we're seeing a lot of this stuff, and the problem is that first of all, women are placed in a position where they're told they have to choose between work life and home life. The other problem is men